بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. So, Alhamdulillah, today is our fifth class, I believe, for an introduction into the sciences of Hadith. And today's topic is a continuation from last week's topic, and that is the famous compilers, right? We said that uh, last week, and today we started this subject last week, which is the famous works that there are alongside the famous compilers of these works. And we're doing them back to back because there's no use of talking about the books first and then talking about the individual who compiled it. So we will do this in all together as kind of the author of the book and the book as well. Last week, we also spoke about the different types, the various types of hadith literature that there are. And what I want to do for the revision part, the chat box is open, so you can answer these questions in the chat box. But basically, let's start with a musnad. Whoever wants to answer this, they can answer this. You can send it to everybody or privately. What is a musnad? We're not going to go through all of the different types of hadith literature, but let's look at some of the more famous ones that we said let's try to memorize and become accustomed to. So what is a musnad, if anybody wants to answer that one? Easiest way you can say musnad. Also, if you want to be unmute, I can do that as well. Just click the raise hand button or the yes button, and I can unmute you and you can just speak. Okay, I don't have any answers coming in yet. I don't know if people are still typing. What is a musnad? If anybody knows. Nobody wants. Oh, okay. I have some answers. Narration according to the chain of narrators. Very good. That's exactly what it is, right? So last week we began with this idea of the different types of literature works. So the hadith works that we have, they're all a certain type of book. And we did the most famous types of books that there are. One of them that we said let's try to be accustomed to, let's try to be familiar with, is the musnad. And a musnad is a hadith book that is organized based off of the chain of or the sanad itself. And that's why the name is there, musnad. And we said this is done in multiple ways. One of the most famous ways is to begin with the Khulafa al-Rashidin, the four famous Khalifas, and then go on to others. Another possible method that this is done is doing it alphabetically. So alphabetical order and based off of the chain of narration. Okay. How about al-Jami'? Al-Jami'. Who wants to answer that one? What is a Jami' type of book? And this is probably one of the most famous type of hadith compilation. Al-Jami' and we have Sunan, and we're going to do both of these back to back. So whoever wants to answer what Jami' is, let's do that one first. Again, if anybody wants to be unmuted, they can just click yes, and I can unmute you, or raise hand, whichever one they want to do. Okay, I'll give it a couple more seconds. Okay, very good. I have another answer here. Book which compiles all of the topics. Very good. So jami', the easiest way to remember this, we said, was the word itself. Jama'a means to compile, to combine. And we said Salatul Jum'ah, a gathering. Salatul Jama'a, congregational prayer. Al-Jami' is a book that compiles. What does it compile? It gathers all of the major topics. And we said there's 8 major topics of Islam, or just in general, you can say the famous Islamic subjects. And al-Jami' gathers all 8 of these. And we said there are 3 very famous Jami' books. Anybody want to type in which 3 famous? You can just type in 1, 2, or 3, however many you know. And the reason why I'm doing this in the review, it just gives you a chance to recall from your own memory instead of me just saying which ones are the Jami'. There are 3 very famous Jami' books. Hint, one of them is the most famous Hadith book, pretty much. Again, if you want to be unmuted, just raise your hand or press yes, and I can unmute you as well. Okay, so we have some answers here. Bukhari, yep, all the answers are correct. So Imam Bukhari's book, Sahih al-Bukhari, is a Jami', al-Jami', right? Imam Muslim's book is also a Jami', and Imam Tirmidhi's book is also a Jami', and it is also a Sunan. So Sunan is the next type of book. What is a Sunan type of book? What special quality, you can say, does a Sunan have? And again, even if you're not typing the answers, it's good if you say them out loud. If you're with people, challenge everybody that's around you to see if you know what is a sunan. What does a sunan do? How does it categorize its topics? Very good. The chapters are divided by the fiqh subject. So sunan are the book that is considered a sunan. It is divided based off of the chapters of fiqh, so tahara, salah, or whatnot. And there are 3 very famous sunans. One of them is Tirmidhi, like we mentioned. What are the other 2? Does anybody remember them? Anybody want to go for the other 2 sunans? Hmm. Okay, that's right. Abu Dawood and Nasa'i. So the other 2 sunans are Abu Dawood and Nasa'i, the sunan of Abu Dawood and the sunan of Nasa'i. Now, ideally, these names that we're mentioning, we're only mentioning the very famous names of hadith books. And like I said, the reason behind that is to become familiar with them. So you should be able to identify these books and know that they are some of the most famous books that there are out there for hadith. Okay, the last type that I asked you guys to memorize was a sharh. What is a sharh? Anybody want to answer that one? Sharh. Okay, very good. Book that gives an explanation of a hadith book. So what a sharh does, sharh literally means explanation. And what it does is it takes an original work and it explains it. And this is, like we mentioned before, for 2 purposes. Number 1, it allows a scholar to elaborate on the hadith that are mentioned within and explain it and break it down. And number 2, it helps students that are trying to study hadith, or even researchers, look at that hadith and understand what a word might mean, what implications this hadith has, what fiqh rulings can we extract from this hadith, and various other aspects of the hadith. So that is a sharh. And these are pretty much the most famous types of books that you'll come across, and the most famous categories of books that you'll come across as well. Then we began discussing the well-known hadith works and the compiler. So what that was the literature types, right? What type of book it is. There was one question actually that we ended with, that somebody asked at the very end, and we ended the class, so we didn't get to answer it. I answered it for that person privately, but I thought it would be beneficial to bring it up during class. And that is, if a hadith is in a certain type of work, so if somebody gathers a hadith in a sunan book, can it also be found in a jami' book? And the answer to that is yes. So just because a hadith is in one particular book or one type of book does not mean that it's kind of limited to that book. It can also be found in other books. And most times you'll find hadiths repeating in all of these books. So you'll find them, somebody might gather it in a jami' and put it under one of the 8 major categories. Another person might put it in a sunan and put it under a bab of fiqh, a category of fiqh. So these hadith, you'll find them all around. It's not that it's limited to one book or anything of that sort. So when we began talking about the well-known hadith works and their compilers, we said we will do 8 works and 8 authors. And these are the most famous 8 books that you'll come across. This is a very important kind of disclaimer, you can say. That is that these books are not by default the best hadith books or anything. So I don't want you to think just because these are the most famous ones, it automatically means that these are the most correct, that these are the only hadith books that are worth looking into, that these are the only trustworthy hadith books, that these are the only hadith books that contain sahih hadith or anything of that sort, right? These are just famous works. They just happen to become famous in comparison to other works that are out there. It doesn't mean by default, like I said, all of those other things that apply. So just because these works, the Siha Sitta, the 6 famous works, just because they're the six famous works does not mean that they're the 6 best works. Put it that way. And it does not mean that they're exclusively sahih and everything else is not sahih. So if you see a quotation from another book, right, that hadith could be stronger than one of these that are present in one of these books that we're doing. We're just familiarizing ourselves with these books because they're the most commonly quoted works, they're the most commonly used books, and they're the most commonly taught books as well. So that's why we're getting used to these books. When you start delving into hadith and even into fiqh, you expand and you start using all of these other books of hadith that are out there that are also very popular, but just not amongst the average person, right? They're very popular amongst researchers or students of knowledge or people who are studying hadith or anything of that field. So coming back to this, that just because we're focusing on these 8 and we're going to go through these 8 does not mean that they're limited to these 8. We did 2 of these books and their authors last class, and that was Imam Malik and the Muwatta of Imam Malik. And the second book that we did was the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, right? So this book, automatically when we say Musnad, we should know it's organized by the Sanad or by the Isnad, the chain of narrations. And Imam Ahmad, the author of the book. And we said both Imam Malik and Imam Ahmad were founders of the schools of fiqh, the Maliki school and the Hanbali school, and they are both muhaddithin. They are both scholars of hadith at the same time. Today, we will be looking at 6 other authors. And these 6 authors are known, or their books are known as the Siha as-Sitta. Or Siha as-Sitta means the 6 correct ones, or the 6 Sahih books. Now, not necessarily every book in there, every hadith in there is Sahih, right? So Imam Ibn Majah's book, Tirmidhi, all of these books contain hadith that are classified as weak as well. But this is the nickname for these 6 books. It is also known as the Kutub al-Sitta, which is probably a better word to use, Kutub al-Sitta, which means the 6 books. Now again, like I mentioned, disclaimer, very important. It does not mean that these are the 6 best books that are out there. It just happens to be that this became the nickname. And you'll see this phrase being used as a quotation. So if a hadith is present in all 6 of these books, it will sometimes say that Kutub al-Sitta, the 6 books. And sometimes it refers to that is present in one of those 6 books. So you know that it's referring to that. And many times scholars began using it in that way as well, that they would just quote and as if it's one book, because we know the 6 famous works. Okay. So let's begin one by one with the biography, or a very basic biography of each one of these authors, and then we will look at a map and see where they're from. And that's probably going to be a very interesting aspect of this class, because we'll get to see on a map how far these people were apart and which part of the world that they were from. Let's begin with Imam al-Bukhari. So Imam al-Bukhari, he was born in the year 194 after Hijrah, and he passed away in the year 256, meaning Sahih al-Bukhari, right? The book itself was in the year 200 to 250, around that date. That's the year Sahih al-Bukhari was actually available or published. So there's 200 years you're looking at between the Prophet, or between Hijrah, right, and Sahih al-Bukhari. And this is why we did a history of the hadith that came before, that there were books before this. Imam Malik's Muwatta was before this. The book compiled by Imam Malik's teacher, Az-Zuhri, that was present before this. We did some of the works that were private works, you can say, compiled by the students of the companions, and the history of all of that. So Imam Bukhari comes at this time, and one of the unique aspects is he decided to compile only Sahih Hadith. So that was his goal. He was born in 194, passed away in 256. He was born in the city or the town of Bukhara, and this is in modern day Uzbekistan. Many of these scholars, you'll see, they will be in or around the same area. So you'll see mainly Khurasan, which is made up of mostly modern day Iran and some of the surrounding areas like Turkmenistan and these countries. They used to be part of Khurasan, and pretty much Persia. That's how you can think of it. So most of them will be from Persia or one of the Turkic countries, modern day Turkic countries. So Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, these countries that are right next to Khurasan as well. Imam Bukhari was born in Bukhara, and Bukhara is actually one of the most beautiful cities. If you haven't seen any masjids or pictures of Bukhara, definitely right after this class, Google Bukhara and you'll be amazed. It's absolutely stunning. The blue marbles that are in the masajid in Bukhara are just beautiful. And at one point that served as one of the major cities of Islamic studies and of Islamic culture and civilization as well. So Imam Bukhari was born there in Bukhara. And Imam Bukhari began his studies very early, at an early age. One of the common themes you'll see throughout these hadith scholars, as we're going through them one by one, is number one, they began at an early age. So they started studying early. Number two, a very common theme that you'll see is that they started to travel to different lands to gather hadith. So it wasn't how knowledge is available to us, nowhere near that with a simple Google, you can pull up almost any hadith book that you want, even though there's a lot of work still to be uploaded or whatnot. But at that time, you would have to travel. And number three, you'll notice that they all had very strong memories, and in many cases, photographic memories. So these are three qualities that you'll see throughout. It's not just limited to Imam Bukhari, you'll see it in Imam Muslim, Tirmidhi, so on and so forth, that they start early, they have very strong memories, and that they travel to gather all of these hadith that they're gathering. So Imam Bukhari, he finished his initial studies at the age of 11, and within about 6 years, right, he gathered as much information and knowledge and education that he could in his city, right, of Bukhara, and the scholars of Bukhara. So he had to travel outside after that. Now, one thing unique about Imam Bukhari was that not only would he memorize the hadith that he would study, he would memorize the narrator, the biography of the narrator, the location and the dates of their birth, their death, and where they traveled, all of this. So he would memorize the details of each and every person that's narrating this hadith. So let's say a chain had 5 people, 6 people, 10 people, whatever it may be in that chain. Imam Bukhari would memorize each and every single person, their biography, where they were born, where they passed away, the dates, and all of that. And this is one of the reasons why Imam Bukhari came up with the strongest conditions for hadith, that he made it upon himself to not take hadith if it doesn't meet his conditions, that if the hadith does not reach those conditions that he set forth, I will not take it. That was Imam Bukhari's trademark pretty much. So Imam Bukhari began to travel around the age of 16. He traveled to Mecca with his mother and brother and performed Hajj as well. And after that, he began a series of journeys throughout different lands. He stayed for about 4 or 5 years in the city of Basra. He traveled to Hijaz. He traveled to Egypt as well. Nishapur. So Nishapur is actually one of the famous ones. We'll talk about it in the next person, which is a very famous city of hadith as well. Imam Bukhari traveled to Baghdad, and he continued to do this for about 4 decades. So about 4 decades, he continued to travel and gather hadith and memorize the biographies and sit with hadith scholars all around. Now, there's a very famous story that in Baghdad, some of the scholars, they tried to they gathered to test Imam Bukhari's memory. So they wanted to see, is this really true or not? Everybody's saying this about Imam Bukhari's memory or whatnot. Let's test it out. So they start narrating hadith, and each one of them starts. There's about 10 people. Each one of them starts narrating 10 hadiths with the chains and everything. And what they would do is they would swap out the chains. So they have Imam Bukhari there. There's 10 of them. It's in Baghdad. They're trying to challenge this person and catch if he's a fraud or not. And they start narrating a chain, right? And they'll narrate a hadith and they'll swap out aspects of it. They'll either swap out the chain, switch around the matan, they'll start switching around things. And they're doing this to kind of catch him out, right? So now you have this hadith scholar, and obviously if he wants, he can say, yeah, I heard that one too. So they ask him, did you hear this one? Did you hear this one? And he's like, no, I haven't heard that. No, I haven't heard that. No, I haven't heard that. To every single one of those hadith, he said, I haven't heard that. When they finished this, he went back and systematically repeated each and every single hadith with the correct chain of narration, fixing the mistakes that they made off of his memory. So this just shows you the strength of Imam al-Bukhari's memory, right? These hadith scholars that we have, especially these major scholars that we're discussing, their memories were not average. So this is very important. Not only did they put in the work, but they had this natural ability to memorize and to kind of admit these chains to their memory. And they were very strong regarding this. Imam Bukhari is also known famously for his piety, his good character, his generosity. These are characteristics that are known about Imam al-Bukhari. Okay, so let's talk about his actual book. It took him about 16 years to compile Sahih al-Bukhari. So Sahih al-Bukhari is compiled in about 16 years. And it's mentioned that this was done, you can kind of say, based on the inspiration or on the advice of one of his teachers, Ishaq ibn Rawaha. Remember this name, Ishaq ibn Rawaha. And he said to him, he just made a comment, and he said, if you were to compile a short but comprehensive collection, right, of authentic sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? This is like a comment he made while Imam Bukhari was with him, and it just stuck with Imam Bukhari, and this kind of inspired him to gather this book, and he eventually gathered it in 16 years. Now, originally, out of 600,000 hadith that he came across, out of 600,000 hadith, he selected 9,082. And if you don't count the ones that repeat, they're about 2,062. So in Sahih al-Bukhari, he selected 9,000, let's just say 9,000 flat, right? Because there's 9,000 precise, but just for an easy memorization of these numbers, about 9,000. And from the 9,000, if you take out all the ones that are repeating, about 2,000 hadith are there in his book. Now, one thing that's mentioned, that Imam Bukhari, every time he would add a hadith to the book, he would pray 2 rak'ahs nafil, right? He would pray 2 rak'ahs nafil. And this is just an interesting point that I wanted to mention on the side, because many times you have, people with these ideas that if you do anything that the Prophet ﷺ didn't do, it's bid'ah, right? But we see these famous scholars that have certain actions, that do certain things out of their own habit, or out of something that they kind of want to do. So this goes back to the discussion on bid'ah. Like, this class is not about bid'ah, but I wanted to point this out, that Imam Bukhari used to do this, and this is obviously not from the Sunnah, not from the companions or anything. That whenever you write down a hadith, pray 2 rakahs or anything of that sort. It was just a personal habit of Imam al-Bukhari, and generally personal habits, like you're praying 2 rakahs Sunnah. Let's say a person comes back from work at 5 o'clock, and they say, you know what, every day when I come back at 5 o'clock, I will pray 2 rakahs. Right? These type of personal habits, they're not bid'ah, as long as you know that it's not sunnah. You understand that what you're doing is not sunnah. And number two, they have a grounding in the sunnah. They have a grounding in the sharia, meaning they have an original source from the sharia. So praying 2 rakahs is valid. It's allowed to pray 2 rakahs anytime except for those periods, obviously when the sun is rising, those times that are haram. It's allowed for you to pray 2 rakahs. So if you make a personal habit of praying at a certain time, knowing that it's not sunnah, it's perfectly fine, and it does not classify as bid'ah or anything of that sort, as long as it meets those conditions that you acknowledge and you know that it's not a sunnah thing that you're doing, but rather a general nafil, right? You're allowed to do it. And number two, that it has a grounding in the sharia. So if I were to tell you, let's go stand in the sun for 3 hours, that doesn't have a foundation. So that's classified as bid'ah. But something that has a foundation, but you make a personal habit out of it, like praying 2 rakahs when you get back from work, praying 2 rakahs nafil before you go to work, or anything of that sort, as a personal habit, it is not considered bid'ah. So Imam al-Bukhari used to do this. Every time he would add a hadith to his book, he would pray 2 rakahs nafil. Okay. The book itself is divided into 96 books, or you can, they're called kitab this, book of this, book of that. And then within that, there's 3,450 chapters. And each chapter is usually given a title and a description. Now, one of the interesting aspects of Imam Bukhari's book is that Imam Bukhari, he was mainly a muhaddith, but he was also a scholar of fiqh. So he also studied fiqh, and he has fiqh opinions. And these are known as the fiqh opinions of Imam al-Bukhari. Some scholars consider him a mujtahid as well, meaning he's to the level where he can deduce and deduct Islamic rulings from original sources, like Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Malik, Imam Ahmad. These are mujtahids. These are scholars or founders of the four famous madhahib. A mujtahid is basically somebody who has a madhab, right? Now, obviously, there's no madhab called the madhab Bukhari or anything of that sort, but Imam al-Bukhari was able to do that according to some scholars. And Imam Bukhari has some of his fiqh present in his book. So in Sahih al-Bukhari, he'll have fiqh rulings that are present there, and he'll give his opinion on certain things. He'll bring in some actions of the companions or whatnot as well. So this is one of the unique aspects of Imam Bukhari's work as well. Okay, so let's move to Sahih Muslim, Imam Muslim's work. Imam Muslim's work is pretty much the second most famous work out of these books that we're doing. Imam Bukhari's is the first most famous, hands down. Now, what's important, actually, I'll mention it here, even though I was going to mention it towards the end, to understand that just because a hadith is sahih, right, whether it's in Bukhari or any other book, just because the hadith is sahih, in terms of, remember we said hadith has two parts, right? You should be able to say it out loud. Every single hadith has two parts. The first part is the sanad, right? The isnad, the chain. The second part is the matan, the text. So just because a hadith is sahih, according to the sanad, the chain is good, put a check mark. The matan, from the outward appearance, is good, we put a check mark. Does not mean that hadith is applicable. Does not mean that hadith is applicable. Meaning, just because a hadith is categorized, categorically meaning, it is sahih, it does not mean it's applicable. There's another aspect, the second step of the process when it comes to fiqh, when it comes to applicability, which is it has to go through another filtration process. You can pretty much kind of phrase it in that way. And that is the batin, the hidden aspects of the hadith. So does it contradict something else or whatnot? And we will actually do a full day focused on some of the conditions that are present amongst the scholars of fiqh, and that's, I think, labeled on the syllabus as hadith or hadith in fiqh or something of that sort. However, on that day we will look at the aspects of how hadith is taken and then either used in fiqh or not used in fiqh. So this is a key aspect or key principle or key rule to remember. Just because a hadith is sahih in the book categorically does not mean it's sahih in terms of its applicability, meaning it does not mean by default that it's automatically applied as a fiqh ruling. And this goes, from this you can kind of say that if somebody tells you, oh, this hadith is in Bukhari, act upon it, right? It does not mean you have to act upon it. You have to look at what the scholars of fiqh say regarding that hadith. Is that applicable? Is that applicable? Is that something applied to us or not? Right? What are the rulings regarding it? So just because a hadith is categorized as sahih does not mean it's applied as sahih. That's a kind of a principle that you probably want to memorize. Okay. So coming to Imam Muslim. Imam Muslim was born in the year 206 after Hijrah. He passed away in the year 261. Similar to Imam Bukhari, Imam Muslim began at an early age. Like we said, the three common principles that you'll see. They start at an early age, they travel, and they have a very strong memory. Imam Muslim traveled to Persia, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Hijaz. He traveled all around, gathering different hadith, sitting with scholars of hadith. He sat with, one of his teachers were Ishaq ibn Rawaha. You remember this name? I said to remember it. This is the teacher of Imam Bukhari. So Imam Muslim actually had a mutual teacher, Ishaq ibn Rawaha. Also, he was the student, Imam Muslim was the student of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, right? The one with the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, also the founder of the Hanbali school. Imam Muslim was also a student of Imam al-Bukhari. So Imam Muslim was a student of Imam al-Bukhari. And he learned hundreds and hundreds of hadith from various teachers that he sat with, that he studied with. He eventually settled in Nishapur. So this is where he was born as well. Imam Muslim, his full name is Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj al-Naysaburi, right? And in Arabic it's Naysaburi, but that's because there's no P. So it's Nishapur, and this is in modern day Iran. Like I said, at the end of this, we'll put up the map and we can see all of these hadith scholars. So Imam Muslim, his book, he took about 300,000 hadith, and from that he selected 7,479. So we can round it up about 7,500 approximately. And if you take out all the repeated hadith, you can narrow it down to about 3,033. 3,000 to round it. So Imam Muslim gathered these hadith in about 15 years. Remember Bukhari, about 16 years. Imam Muslim's work, about 15 years. That's how long he spent on writing this. Now there's a quote I want to read to you from Dr. Jonathan Brown. He says, Muslim wrote his Sahih as a response to what he saw in the laxity, so the atmosphere that was there. That people were just narrating any hadith. They didn't have a concern if it's sahih, if it's not sahih, if it's made up or whatnot. They weren't checking into the sanad. And so he wrote his book out of a response to this. And this is one of the things that Imam Muslim actually states, that people stopped caring about if the hadith is actually sahih. They would not put it through an authentication process. So one of the purposes that he did this work, or that he compiled this book, was to combat that, to counter that he wanted to gather those things that are sahih that go back to the Prophet ﷺ. So that's the work of Imam Muslim. That's 2 out of the 6 that we're doing. The next one is Imam al-Tirmidhi. Imam Tirmidhi, his name is Abu Isa Muhammad ibn al-Isa al-Tirmidhi. He was born 209 after Hijrah, passed away 279. Now notice all of these years are very similar. So these authors, they're all around the same time frame. He traveled, like we mentioned, he traveled throughout the Muslim lands, and he's been to or he studied in Iraq, Persia, Khurasan. He was the student of Imam al-Bukhari, Imam Muslim, Imam Abu Dawud. Right, so all of these names that I just mentioned, they're all going to be authors of these 6 major works that we're doing. So Imam Tirmidhi is a student of Imam Bukhari and Muslim and Abu Dawud, who we're going to talk about shortly. So that was Imam Tirmidhi. Similar to Imam al-Bukhari, right? Imam Tirmidhi had a very sharp memory. So he had a very strong memory as well. And it's mentioned that one time he was with a hadith scholar who started narrating hadith, and Imam Tirmidhi was taking notes, and it was about 16 pages long. And unfortunately, Imam Tirmidhi kind of lost this, and he couldn't review this. And he was asked to review the notes while the hadith scholar dictates them again. So the hadith scholar is going to repeat him. And as he's narrating, Imam Tirmidhi grabs some empty sheets of paper, not to make it obvious that he doesn't have the original hadith, and he starts pretending that he's reviewing it from here. However, when the scholar of hadith says, the papers are blank, right? The papers that you're reviewing or that you're looking at are blank. And Imam Tirmidhi actually says that he remembered every single hadith, and he starts verbatim repeating each and every single hadith. So this is, again, to show the memory of Imam at-Tirmidhi. Imam at-Tirmidhi, also another very unique aspect about his book is that his idea was to compile those hadith that are used by the scholars of fiqh. And he mentions that, this is what Imam Tirmidhi says. He says, every hadith in this book is acted upon by some scholar, right? So out of, the four major schools of fiqh, whatever it may be, every single hadith that you'll find in this book is found somewhere. Some scholar is using this as a proof of what their outcome is in terms of their fiqh ruling, except for two hadith. And the two hadith are, if he drinks a fourth time, then the punishment is death, right? And this is not acted upon by any of the scholars of fiqh. And the second hadith he mentions is he combined, meaning the Prophet ﷺ combined Dhuhr and Asr in Medina without fear or travel. This is another hadith that's not acted upon. And that's why I said, just because a hadith is found in one of these books or is classified as sahih or whatever it may be, does not mean the scholars of fiqh are acting upon that hadith for various reasons. And as we go through this class, this concept will become, inshallah, more apparent to all of us. And as we do that class on the relationship between fiqh and hadith, we will kind of have a more clear vision on why there are more conditions when you take the hadith and then apply it into fiqh. And this is actually what leads to many misconceptions regarding hadith. So you'll find people, some of these people go to extremes that they only take the Quran, they reject complete, works of hadith or all the hadith or whatnot. And they base it off of the fact that, oh, look, in Bukhari or in Muslim or in this, you find these hadith, how can somebody act upon this? Just because the hadith is gathered as sahih does not mean it's acted upon. And that's key. There are other reasons it can fail the test of fiqh. And like I said, inshallah, we'll become accustomed to this. Okay, so Imam at-Tirmidhi, as we're talking about, he categorized his book as a sunan. So it's chaptered in terms of the way that the sunan are by the fiqh topics. And then after that, he has the topics that are amongst the Jami'ah topics, the 8 major categories of Islamic topics that there are. And Imam Tirmidhi has about 3,956 hadith in this book. All right, so there's another quote by Imam Tirmidhi. He says, I compiled this book and then presented it to the scholars of Hijaz and Iraq and Khurasan, and they were all pleased with it. And this is one of the things that Imam Tirmidhi's book was accepted soon as he kind of released it. The people, the scholars around him, they all accepted this. All right, let's move on to the Sunan of Abi Dawood. We have 3 books left. These are a little shorter. So this Imam Abu Dawood, his name was Abu Dawood Sulaiman ibn al-Ash'ath Ash-Sajistani, right, from Sajistan. And again, we're going to put the map up. And this is another place in Khurasan along the borders of Afghanistan, I believe, as we'll see when the map comes up. He was born in the year 202, and he passed away in the year 275. He was born in Sajistan and he passed away in Basra. And he's buried next to the great scholar Sufyan al-Thawri rahimahullah. Again, Imam Abu Dawud began at a very early age. He traveled all around. So he traveled to Hijaz, to Egypt, to Basra, to Kufa, to Baghdad, to Damascus, to Khurasan, to all of these different lands, collecting and sitting with hadith scholars, collecting hadith and sitting with hadith scholars. It's also known about him that he had a photographic memory. So like we said, that many of these scholars, not only did they have a strong memory, but also a photographic memory. They can remember everything. And Imam Shafi is actually one of them as well that has a photographic memory. Again, Imam Shafi is not our discussion, but he's known for this type of memory. Imam Shafi's memory is very sharp as well. Imam Abu Dawud's Sunan, because his work is classified as a Sunan, is the first to be produced in this genre. So the genre of Sunan, where you divide these as chapters of fiqh, is the first work. And he out of 500,000 hadith, he collected 5,274, so rounded to 5,000, and 4,800 without any repetition. There's actually a statement of Imam Abu Dawud that I want to share. And this is a course that I taught as well. It's a 3-week course that we did based off of this statement. He says that I have written 500,000 hadith. So I have, of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I wrote in this book, meaning the Sunan of Abu Dawud, I wrote in this book 4,800, some of them that are sahih and those that resemble it, meaning they're hasan, they're close to sahih. And sufficient for a person's religion are 4 of the hadith. So this is a quote from Imam Abu Dawud that we took, and we actually made a course out of this. So sufficient for a person's religion are 4 hadith. What are these 4 hadith? The first one is إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. All deeds are based on their intention. So deeds are judged according to their intention. The second hadith is لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. None of you will be true believers until you love for your brothers and sisters what you love for yourself. The third hadith is إن من حسن الإسلام المرء تركه ما لا يعنيه. That verily from the perfection of one's iman, of one's faith, is to leave those things that do not concern that individual. And the fourth hadith that he mentions is الحلال بين والحرام بين وبينهما أمور مشتبهات or mushabbihat, that the halal is clear, the haram is clear, and in between are the gray areas, those that are unknown. So he mentions that out of all the hadith that he compiled, sufficient for a person's religion. If you truly act upon these 4, that's sufficient for a person's religion. Okay, that's Abu Dawud. His work is also known as a comprehensive legal work. So Hadith al-Ahkam, it's comprehensive legal work in terms of the hadith that are related to the ahkam, the rulings. The next one is the Sunan of An-Nasa'i. He was born in Nasa, again another town in Khurasan, Persia, and he was born in the year 215. He passed away in 303 in Damascus, modern-day Syria. And at the age of 15, he traveled to Balkh, and later he traveled to Iraq, to Syria, to Hijaz, to Egypt, and eventually he settled in Egypt. Now, he was known to be one of the leading scholars of hadith at his time, and his book has two versions, you can say. He has the Sunan al-Kubra, which is the larger work, and he presented this to the governor of Ramallah at that time in Palestine, and he asked, is everything in here sahih, in this collection? So he told him it contains both. So the governor told him that, why don't you compile a work that only contains sahih? So he then abridged or summarized that original work known as the Sunan al-Sughra, the smaller Sunan. So he has 2 versions of this work, the larger version and the smaller version. Smaller version is pretty much almost all sahih except for a few narrations that have issues with it. The last hadith book is the Sunan of Ibn Majah. Now these 6 names of the hadith book, I want you to memorize them and their authors as well. They're the most commonly quoted books, like we said. The Sunan of Ibn Majah is written by, and they're very easy to memorize, they're named after their authors usually, is written by Imam Ibn Majah. And Imam Ibn Majah was born in Qazwin. This is a town in Iran, modern day Iran as well. And he was born in the year 209. He passed away in the year 279. And again, like every other scholar that we mentioned, he started at an early age and then he traveled. So he traveled across the Muslim lands and gathered hadith from various areas. Now, Imam Ibn Majah was also known as a mufassir of the Quran. So he was a scholar of hadith and also a mufassir. He was a scholar of tafsir as well. In his work, he compiled, in his hadith work, he compiled 4,341 hadith, so 4,300. And he divided it into 38 books, 1,500 chapters. Out of these 4,341, there are 3,000 of them approximately that are included in the other 5 books. So about 3,000 are included, and about 1,300 are exclusive to this book that are not in the other 5 books. Now, Sunan Ibn Majah, there's a discussion whether it's included amongst these 6 books or not. So some of the scholars of the Maliki Madhab mainly, they say that Imam Malik's Muwatta is included in these 6 books and not the Sunan of Ibn Majah. Other scholars say that it is the Sunan of Ibn Majah. Again, these 6 books, it's not that, it's these 6 and it has to be these 6 or whatnot. It's just something that caught on. It just became famous. That's all it is. There's nothing else to it. So people started referring to them as the 6 books, the 6 works, and they became common amongst people. So that's why they took this position in Islamic scholarship. Again, it's not that they're special or that they have, they're special in a sense. I don't want to take away from the works, especially books like Bukhari and Muslim or whatnot, but they're not exclusive, that the only Sahih hadith that are present are in these books. All right, so these are the 6 major scholars. Now let me do a screen share and let's look at the different areas where they're from. This map is provided by Feed. It's not a map that I made. That's why I didn't take off Feed from the bottom of it. It's not the right thing to do. Steal somebody else's work. Bismillah, let's look at. So I don't know if the colors are showing on your screen, but on my screen, there's 2 different shades of orange. One is like a lighter orange, one is a darker orange. The lighter orange are the Imams of fiqh, and that's not our discussion really. Actually, I guess Imam Malik, Imam Ahmad we talked about. So let's look at Imam Malik. Imam Malik was born in Medina, right? And we said Imam Malik pretty much never left Medina except for Hajj. And Imam Malik was known as the Imam of Medina. So this is Imam Malik, the Muwatta of Imam Malik. Hopefully my mouse is kind of showing. So he's from Medina, modern day Saudi Arabia. Imam Ahmad's from Baghdad, Iraq, right? Imam Abu Hanifa is from Kufa, Iraq. Imam Shafi'i was born in Gaza, Palestine, in Gaza, modern day. And eventually he moved to Egypt. Okay, let's look at these 6. These are the ones that we discussed today. Start with Imam Bukhari. So modern day Uzbekistan. That's where Imam Bukhari is from, Bukhara. Imam Muslim is from Nishapur, or in Arabic, Naysabur. Again, it's Nishapur because there's no P in Arabic. Modern day Iran. All of these borders, they're contemporary borders, so you can kind of imagine these lands were just open areas, with this area being known as Khurasan. So Khurasan is where Imam Muslim was born. Imam Ibn Majah, Qazwin, Iran. Qazwin it still is a place for Islamic scholarship. Nowadays, it's a place for Shia scholarship. One of the most famous Shia centers, the equivalent of the Sunni Al-Azhar, is in Qazwin, I believe. It's called Qum, and that's the main Shia center for knowledge. And they have in Iraq as well, actually. Imam An-Nasa'i was born in Nasa, modern day Turkmenistan. It's on the border of Iran and Turkmenistan. Again, this area was known as Khorasan. So these modern day lines, they separate these countries now, but it was known as Khorasan. Imam Abu Dawood, again, Iran, modern day Iran, Afghanistan, this border, and even Pakistan, just at the tip right there. I don't know what area of Pakistan that is, but that corner. Imam Tirmidhi was born in modern day Uzbekistan as well. So as you can see, most of these scholars, they were from either the Turkic areas or Khorasan in general, and that's modern day Iran. Now, a question might come to your mind, and that is, I'll send this chart, by the way, in the group, so you can screenshot it, but I'll also send it, inshallah. Let's exit out of the screen share. Okay. So a question might come to your mind that how are, most of these hadith scholars, most of these Sunni works are all, Iran that you see. What's interesting is modern day Iran was not predominantly Shia. So throughout the history of Iran, Iran was not actually majority Shia. Iran was majority Sunni for most of history, for most of Islamic history. It was only until about the 1500s, where you have the Safavid Empire, right? The Safavid Empire, the Safavid dynasty, which took over those lands, and they adopted Shiaism as their official creed. And they also, it's when you read into it, it's a very unpleasant history in terms of forced conversions and very strict rules in terms of anybody who claims that they're Sunni or anything of that sort. So majority of Islamic history, the major lands of Iran was Sunni for most of Islamic history up until the 1500s. Then it switched over to Shia. The Shia hub before that was mainly Iraq. So Iran was not Shia for most of Islamic history. And that's why a lot of these hadith scholars, they're all from Iran and that area. So it kind of confuses people when they see that, oh, these people are from Iran, but why are all the major Sunni hadith scholars coming from Iran, a Shia area? It wasn't Shia at that time at all. Like, it had nothing to do with Shiaism. So that comes a lot later. And again, that's not the subject of this class. That's, in my personal opinion, that's a very interesting subject that I'd recommend everybody reading into. That's the history, and that's part of Aqidah as well, but mainly Islamic history and the movement of empires and the movement of ideologies in the different Muslim lands. Again, coming back to our topic, so these scholars of hadith, they were in these lands that were predominantly Sunni at the time. And as you can see, most of the famous scholars of hadith, they were not Arab, so they were not, native Arabs, you can say. They learned Arabic, but most of them were from Persia or the Turkic countries, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, or whatnot. So we will end with this, inshallah. I will open it up for Q&A. If anybody has any questions, they can ask. Let me stop the live stream.